Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Coming up, we'll review the week's top stories about the ongoing crisis of non-citizen arrivals in Chicago and beyond, and another hearing challenging Illinois' gun and magazine ban that could result in the law being struck down. I'll then join the Center Square's Dan McCaleb to further discuss those stories and more. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop.
Breaking news, that's what the Center Square does best. The stories other media outlets refuse to report, the Center Square's breaking them all the time. Stories about government waste and political spending, stories about partisan agendas that hijack your tax dollars. The Center Square has it all covered and delivers the biggest news to your inbox as it happens. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletters at thecentersquare.com. That's thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Here's some of the top stories from the past week. Questions surround how Chicago will be able to afford some of the increased spending in Mayor Brandon Johnson's budget proposal that includes $150 million for non-citizen care. Andrew Hensel has more.
Chicago's fiscal year 2024 budget is due to the City Council by October 15th for consideration. On Wednesday, Johnson released his proposal. Because the city is already facing a significant budget hole, Governor J.B. Pritzker was asked if the state's taxpayers will be asked to help.
I don't know what the intentions are with it. I just saw it as you did yesterday, the proposal.
Bryce Hill of the Illinois Policy Institute says the state does not have the money to support Johnson's inflated budget.
They don't do anything to close the structural gap that the city is already projecting could be in excess of $1 billion in coming years.
The total budget cost will be $16.6 billion. I'm Andrew Hensel.
While a ruling is pending out of the 7th Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals on a challenge to Illinois' gun and magazine ban, the Southern District of Illinois Federal Court could rule the law unconstitutional. Back in District Court Wednesday, Attorney Thomas Magg argued the law is vague around the list of firearms and magazines that are banned because there are a slew of such devices that are interchangeable between rifles and handguns. Arguing for the state, Attorney Christopher Wells said that doesn't rise to the level of a successful vagueness challenge. Judge Stephen McGlynn, who had previously ordered a preliminary injunction in the case, said the crux is whether the law infringes on a constitutional right to keep and bear arms. After the hearing, Magg said the judge's questions make him confident there will be a ruling against the law.
Whether he enjoins the entire statute or just part of it, I think he could go either way. Obviously, I would prefer an injunction against the entire statute, but that's another of the factors he has to consider.
McGlynn took the case under advisement and didn't indicate when he'd rule. Those are the top stories from the past week from Illinois. Find more online at thecentersquare.com. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, I'll join the Center Square's executive editor Dan McCaleb. This is Illinois in Focus, a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Greg Bishop.
Are you looking for fair news coverage out of the nation's capital? Join the Center Square's editor-in-chief Dan McCaleb and DC Bureau Chief Casey Harper as they discuss all things coming out of Washington, D.C.
And as you said, I did a fact check on this because I really found it pretty misleading. Gas prices, yes, are down. But if you look at food prices, they increased.
No spin, just the news. Listen to the America in Focus podcast at americastalking.com or wherever you get your podcast.
Greetings and welcome to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, executive editor of the Center Square Newswire service. Joining me today is Greg Bishop, the Center Square's Illinois Capitol Bureau's senior reporter and editor. How are you today, Greg?
That's a lot added to my title, Dan. I'm doing well. Yourself?
I'll tell you what, it's a mouthful, too.
You could just say I'm the guy on the ground in Springfield. And we're getting ready to gear up for fall veto session, which is going to be a lot of activity. And there's plenty to talk about heading into that.
I know there is, but we got a few other things to talk about today as well, Greg. We are recording this on Thursday, October 12th. Greg, Chicago will host the 2024 National Democratic Convention next summer, where President Joe Biden is expected to be renominated ahead of next year's November presidential election. But many people are wondering how the ongoing migrant crisis in Chicago will impact that. More than 17,000 border crossers have arrived in the city over the past year, and Chicago, like cities across the country, is struggling to deal with it. There are many tentacles to this story, Greg, but let's start here. On CBS's Face the Nation this week, Governor Pritzker was asked if Chicago and Illinois officials were going to be prepared to host in the middle of the migrant crisis. How did the governor respond to that?
Yeah, he says that they will be prepared, but he provided a caveat of as long as the federal government provides help. And he's said time and again, state taxpayers have been paying hundreds of millions of dollars. He's put the number at more than $500 million between state and city of Chicago taxpayers to help with the ongoing influx of non-citizens. But at the same time, the governor has also said that the federal taxpayers have to provide some kind of assistance. So again, he says that they'll be ready to handle the security questions around the DNC next year with the ongoing and what seems to be increased influx of non-citizens, but he's saying that the federal government needs to step up and not just provide more resources, but he also says that it's, as the governor says, quote, border politicians that should also be addressed because he claims that they're only sending these migrants, these non-citizens, to blue cities and blue states, as the governor characterizes it. But really, if you take a step back and look at the situation on the ground on the border, Dan, and you can see all of this being reported regularly with thecentersquare.com, you've got serious problems with those border communities. They're running out of resources, and they're taking in somewhere to around 2.8 million people just in the past fiscal year, according to the federal government. So it's a situation that even the governor has said is untenable, but he claims that they'll be able to handle it just as long as they have some help from the federal government heading into the Democratic National Convention next year.
Yeah, quick point about the border towns. Earlier this year, the Center Square covered President Joe Biden's first and, as far as I know, only visit to the border when he visited El Paso, a town that's really at the heart of the illegal border crossings, the center of the universe when it comes to that. They had thousands and thousands of migrants who were living on the streets. I think it was January of this year when President Biden took his first and only tour of the border, visited El Paso, and ahead of that, city of El Paso officials, federal and state officials, essentially cleared the streets. So President Biden, didn't have to see the worst of it. Do you envision something like that? I know we're still, many months away, but do you envision Chicago having to do something like that?
Yeah, and setting up some kind of perimeter of sorts to ensure that the national spotlight cameras may not see some of the tents that are being set up. I mean, keep in mind, Dan, we haven't even gotten into the winter of 2023 yet, and we'll see how it all falls into place. But you've got the city ready, and even the state seeming to cover some of those costs. The taxpayers on the hook for $30 million in military base camp tents that are going to be set up heading into the winter. So the optics obviously is one thing, but when you really get down to this, and especially hearing about the stories on the border, the humanitarian issues at hand here are also of top concern, because the migrants are here in Illinois, as they are in New York, as they are in other states and cities across the country, sanctuary state and cities across the country. So how that's going to be handled, not just fiscally, but with a humanitarian lens, is going to be interesting, especially around the optics of the Democratic National Convention in the Windy City.
Yeah, speaking of sanctuary cities and states, Greg, Chicago is a sanctuary city. Illinois is a sanctuary state. Texas's governor, who's not the only one, not the only elected official who has this busing mission in place, moving migrants north to sanctuary cities because of their self-declared welcoming cities. But a new poll out regarding a new poll of Chicago residents show that a majority don't favor Chicago being a sanctuary city. Just briefly touch on that if you could.
Yeah, M3 Strategies is a polling and consulting firm, and they did a poll of around 700 voters across the demographics, and they found that the ideas of sanctuary city policies are not favorable. The poll essentially found that the majority of people polled don't like the idea of Chicago being a sanctuary city. And then when you drill down even further, the pollster found that some interesting results that might go against the conventional thinking of Chicago being a Democrat city. And it's been a Democrat city for decades. And you're talking about very liberal policies coming out of Chicago that are supported by the voters who keep putting liberal politicians back into office time and again. For instance, Donald Trump got like 17% of the vote in Chicago. That should give you a little bit of an idea of how Democrat Chicago is. But the poll found out that the majority of people, voters in Chicago, don't like sanctuary city policies. What's fascinating, though, is the poll, when you look at the demographics, whites across Chicago are in favor of keeping sanctuary cities at about double-digit margins, the pollsters say. Non-whites, Hispanics, blacks, and others, they're overwhelmingly in favor of ending sanctuary city policies. For black Chicagoans, it's plus 20% in ending sanctuary city status. So while this policy is questioned by voters in Chicago, this poll shows that, but it's not just the polling, Dan. It's town hall meetings that communities across Chicago are holding where citizens are angry about the resources being spent on non-citizens, about the tax dollars that aren't going to their communities to lift them up. So this is obviously something that is hitting people on the streets. They see the resources going one way or the other. And I'm not quite sure how this is going to play out politically. But all of this, as it seems to be revving up with intensity, with dozens of buses a week coming to Chicago, again, a city with sanctuary policies.
Right. It doesn't look like this crisis is going to end anytime soon because the buses keep arriving. The migrants who cross the border in the South keep getting off those buses, bringing more people to Chicago. Our listeners can keep up with this ongoing story at thecentersquare.com. But Greg, let's move on. We've also reported at the centersquare.com a lot about Illinois' new ban on more than 170 semi-automatic rifles, shotguns, pistols, and the like. I say new, it's really not new anymore. Governor Pritzker signed it into law in January. There have, of course, been ongoing challenges in state court and federal court. The federal court one is where in federal court is where the challenges are still alive. There was a court hearing in downstate Illinois, Greg, this week. You were there. You covered it. Tell us what you heard.
Yeah, and I understand if this can get rather confusing pretty quick, but we have the Seventh Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals for the federal courts that has a question about whether or not Illinois' gun and magazine ban enacted in January violates the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals is dealing with that. And that case is actually a collection of cases from the Northern District of Illinois and the Southern District of Illinois. And there are differing opinions. The Northern District judges sided with the state and local governments with gun and magazine bans. The Southern District judge actually issued an injunction, a preliminary injunction on the law back in April, if you recall. So that's before it got to the Seventh Circuit. So the Seventh Circuit 3-judge panel heard arguments about the Second Amendment's challenge in late June. We still don't have a ruling out of that Seventh Circuit court. But in that same collection of cases, one in particular, brought by attorney Thomas Magg, he raised not just Second Amendment issues, he also raised 14th Amendment issues of vagueness, saying that the law is unconstitutionally vague. So since right now the Seventh Circuit's dealing with the Second Amendment questions, Magg is asking the Southern District judge that issued the injunction before to take up the issue of vagueness, saying that the law is unconstitutionally vague. They had a hearing not on a preliminary injunction, which again, the Seventh Circuit's dealing with on the Second Amendment issue. No, they took up a hearing on summary judgment, which if the judge rules in favor of attorney Thomas Magg on vagueness, it could lead to the entire law being struck down with a summary judgment. It would not be a preliminary injunction that says the judge believes that the plaintiffs could be successful in the merits of their case. No, the judge in the Southern District could strike the law down. So the hearing was on Wednesday for that particular motion for summary judgment on vagueness grounds. And the plaintiffs, Thomas Mag, he laid out how there are a lot of different magazines that are banned because they hold more than 15 rounds for a rifle, but they can be interchangeable with a handgun. So handgun magazine bans are, 15 and up. For rifles, it's 10 and up. So if you've got an interchangeable magazine that can go into a pistol, but also go into a rifle, Mag argues that that magazine ban is too vague. The enforcement of it opens up a lot of problems. So he made that argument. He also said the list of firearms that the state has banned, there are duplicates on there that equate an AR model to a different type of model when they're not the same. So he says that essentially it's too vague to enforce. The state fired back and said Mag's arguments don't rise to the level that's needed for a vague challenge. So they went back and forth, but Judge Stephen McGlynn in the Southern District of Illinois, he asked very pointed questions about the enforcement of this. He asked about, couples in a home who one may own the rifle, the other may own the handgun, but they have these interchangeable magazines. Who's going to be prosecuted? He highlighted how maybe this is about vagueness, but it's ultimately about a constitutional fundamental right of the Second Amendment. He also discussed and asked the states directly. This was interesting. He asked the state directly if the state was going to use ammo sales purchases to track whether or not somebody has registered their firearm. And that's another element here that the judge started out with in the hearing on Wednesday in East St. Louis. He said, listen, the registry is open already. That opened October 1st. And he said people are already registering their guns. So this needs to be resolved sooner than later so that there's certainty on how to move forward on this. So it's interesting to hear those judges' questions and how that could ultimately play out. When I talked with Thomas Mag after the hearing, he said that he's confident that Judge Stephen McGlynn in the Southern District Federal Court could issue an injunction against the law, a motion for summary judgment. Now, whether or not it's going to be narrowly crafted to a couple of provisions of the law, or if it's going to be the entirety of the law struck down, that has yet to be seen. But at least the plaintiffs in this case, they're confident that they're going to get a favorable ruling. Now, the next element here, which is fascinating, is that gun registry that opened October 1st. I had asked Illinois State Police for any kind of data on how many people have actually registered. And they said that they're going to start publishing the data on their website as to how many firearm owners are registering and how many have been registered. So after the first week, some interesting totals here, Dan. There are 2.4 million firearm owner identification card holders. The FOID card is the card that Illinoisans are required to have by state law in order to purchase and possess firearms and ammunition. 2.4 million across the state. In the first week, there were only 1,050 people who filed. And that comes out to less than 0.5% of people who filed in the first week. So I don't know if that's an indication of what the compliance rate's ultimately going to be, but we'll be watching this closely as well, because if the law is not struck down in court, then if you don't register your firearm, your semi-automatic firearm that's banned, you could face criminal penalties of between a Class A misdemeanor for the first offense or a Class 3 felony for the second offense. Right. So there's some significant consequences here if this does not get dealt with in the federal courts in a timely fashion. And again, that's something else that Judge Stephen McGlynn said he's anxiously awaiting whatever the appellate court rules with the Second Amendment. But it'll be interesting to see what kind of judicial interplay there is if he strikes the law down with the vagueness claims and how that might impact the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals ruling. So a lot's going on here. We're on top of it, and it's something that you can continue to track at thecentersquare.com/Illinois.
One point of clarity, Greg, on the registry, very small number of people so far have gone in to register their now banned weapons that are sort of grandfathered in since before Governor Pritzker signed the ban into law, but not necessarily every one of those 2.4 million FOID card holders own banned weapons or banned accessories or banned magazines. So the 2.4 million number is the number of FOID card owners, but some portion of that would own some of those banned weapons, etc.
And there's no way for us to know that exactly, how many of such FOID card holders have, say, an AR-15 or a handgun that only takes magazines of over 17 rounds, for instance. So, yeah, and that's kind of, a way of just setting a benchmarker of sorts. Right. There's close to 13 million people in Illinois. 2.4 million actually have a FOID card, meaning that they claim to be a firearm owner. What actual percentage of those have a semi-automatic rifle, shotgun, or pistol that fits this category that's banned? That's not known. But obviously, the compliance rate, apparently, within the first week, seems like it is very low.
Greg, just a few more minutes for one final story. Yet another government financial watchdog gave Illinois a failing grade for its financial situation. Truth in Accounting, which is based in Chicago, released its 14th annual financial state of the states report and gave Illinois another F. And the state's ranked 48th out of the 50 states for its financial stability. Tell us a little bit more about it.
Yeah, so obviously we've been covering this for quite some time, and we've been looking at the financial reports from Truth in Accounting for years at the Center Square. They've got these now 14 years in a row. They've been putting these fiscal state of the state reports out. And it shows, and it has shown time and again, Illinois at the bottom or near the bottom when it comes to fiscal health. Truth in Accounting looks at these things from a taxpayer's lens where they have different ratings than, say, what the credit rating agencies have. Credit rating agencies have, AAA, double B minus, or, however they may rate things. And Truth in Accounting's quick to say that those are ratings for bond agencies and for bond holders, not necessarily for the taxpayers. So when they look at this, they look at overall taxpayer burden of debt a state may have. So Illinois getting an F, they break down the numbers and show that every Illinois taxpayer is on the hook for $41,600 in the state of Illinois. And that is from the state's pension funds, but also something that's not talked about enough, and that is the other post-employment benefits, the OPEBs. And those are benefits like health insurance. And in the state of Illinois, Tier 1 pensioners who have 3% compounded increased pension benefits, they also get subsidized health insurance, fully subsidized health insurance. So that's an extra cost, and they place that overall number at well over $170 billion of debt that the state of Illinois has and that the state's taxpayers are going to be on the hook for.
You mentioned that taxpayer burden of $41,000 plus dollars that every taxpayer would be on the hook for if we were to pay down the state's debt. You have an extra $41,000 you want to send to the state of Illinois?
Yeah, let me get right on that. I'll just, who do I give that to? The treasurer or the comptroller?
I don't know. I jest, of course, but that is let's face it, that is quite a burden, no matter what side of the aisle on, where your views are politically. That's a burden on Illinois taxpayers that you would think state lawmakers would be interested in taking care of. Greg, that is all the time we have as usual. Thank you for your insights into these very important stories affecting Illinois taxpayers. Readers can keep up with all of Greg's reporting at thecentersquare.com. For Greg Bishop, I'm Dan McCaleb. Please subscribe, and thank you for listening.